Already facing the NBA's murkiest future, the Phoenix Suns' outlook somehow got even grimmer this month. It started ahead of the trade deadline, when Phoenix traded an unprotected 2031 first-rounder for 3 lesser firsts in an effort to increase its pick supply. The Suns hoped Bradley Beal would waive his no-trade clause to facilitate a deal for Jimmy Butler, then moved on to the possibility of replacing Kevin Durant with Butler, and even came close to sending KD back to the Bay. But in the end, the Suns didn't use any of those picks to get better. In fact, Phoenix moved a first-rounder to get off of Jusuf Nurkic's contract. If you're keeping track at home, that means the only draft capital this aging 11th place team has over the next 7 years is a collection of pick swaps in which the Suns will always receive the worst pick. Some have defended team owner Matt Ishbia for at least trying to win at all costs, but trading for Bradley Beal a couple years ago showed he has no idea how to actually build a winner. The most expensive roster in NBA history is currently a losing team on track to miss the West's play-in tournament with the league's toughest remaining schedule. They don't control any of their own picks, first or second round, until 2032. And even their first rounder that year could be frozen soon if Phoenix doesn't get under the second apron. Meanwhile, Beal still has a no-trade clause, and KD, who's extension eligible this summer, knows the team tried to trade him. It's a full-blown dumpster fire. All that's left to do now is watch this recklessly assembled team burn. And with that, welcome to the Unfiltered Show from the Score Studios. My name is Joseph Casciaro. Joining me in studio, the Score's Chicco and Nacion. And joining us remotely today, making her Unfiltered Show debut, TSN's Shantelle Chand. Shantelle, what's going on?
Not too much. Excited to talk some hoops, especially since the Suns are such a dumpster fire. I think we're really going to get into it.
Yeah, the Suns, if you're a Suns fan, obviously you hate this, but if you're not a Suns fan and you work in NBA media, they are the gift that keeps on giving because the content they give us just by being the dumpster fire we're talking about is unbelievable. No, Chicco?
It's crazy. Like, you cannot fathom how they have just messed up this entire situation so fast within a year and a half of getting KD? Yeah. It's absolutely absurd.
Yeah. It's crazy because, like, it felt like they were as all in gets when they made the move for KD a few years ago and, like, moved all those picks. And then they've somehow just kept digging deeper to trade for Beal, moving a first-rounder to get off of Nurkic, trading an unprotected first-rounder this year to get 3 worse first. Like, it's just a disaster. It got me thinking, can either of you think of a team in NBA history, or at least in our lifetimes, that was as screwed, for lack of a better term, than the Suns are right now? Shantelle, we'll start with you.
Well, I go back to KD because he's moved around so much. But remember when they tried to trade for James Harden, the Brooklyn Nets, and they gave up like 4 first-rounders for James Harden? That was ridiculous. And also then you had Kyrie leave, you had KD leave. And then you saw the Brooklyn Nets try to build around a Mikal Bridges. That didn't work. And they're still rebuilding to this day. In terms of a salary cap, though, I don't think I've ever seen something this messy ever. And I think Matt Ishbia doesn't actually understand the new CBA or this new deal. Like, he just might not know how the new NBA works. You can't just have 3 old guys on a team and be like, you know what, we're going to form a super team and we're going to win this way. It just doesn't work that way. So if I had to pick a team that was kind of similar, I just remember the Brooklyn Nets being a mess a few years ago after that James Harden trade.
Chicco?
Yeah, even sticking with the Nets, I mean, you can go way back when they traded for Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce, and they tried to, they thought those two still had some juice left, and I think all it got them was 1 playoff series, and cost them, set them back so much back in their rebuild. They didn't have any picks to build around, and there were a lot of players that they could have gotten hypothetically with those picks, and I think the crazy part is like, they actually did a decent job kind of getting out of that
because KD and Kyrie signed there.
Yeah, because they got really good drafting. They traded for first round picks. They took on additional salaries. Like, I think one of the deals they got DeMarre Carroll's contract from Toronto. They took a first round pick. And they were able to find talent deep in the draft like Jared Allen and kind of build that up. And then they accelerated the process, as we all saw with KD and Kyrie, and that didn't work either.
Yeah.
But that's probably the closest one.
Yeah,
I can think of the top of my head.
Yeah, I'd agree. Probably like the Nets trading for Garnett and Pierce, and in constructing those teams around Darren Williams in the early 2010s, I went back and looked. The Nets traded picks that turned into Damian Lillard, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and Colin Sexton in the span of like a few years. So that's kind of always been the shining example, or the not so shining example, of like a team absolutely mortgaging its future without any short-term results to show for it. But I think the Suns have blown that out of the water. Like, they are 11th place in the West. Like, they're not even going to make the play-in tournament. And they've got the most expensive team ever. And to Chantelle's point about Matt Ishbia not seeming like he understands the new NBA, at least those Nets we're talking about were in a different NBA. Like, yes, they were screwed from a standpoint of they didn't have picks to rebuild and all that, but they weren't also dealing with the ramifications of the second apron and everything that comes with that. Like I said, the Suns' next first-round pick that they control is 2032, and it's about to be frozen because they're over the second apron.
And I think if they were to keep this roster intact, which I find it very unlikely they do that, their luxury tax bill is going to be about $400 million or so next year, which is just, it's unfathomable. Like, we thought some of the numbers, years back with the Warriors and the luxury tax they were paying was pretty crazy. But, I mean, what's happening with the Suns is just blown out of the water.
And in the Warriors' defense, even if they had continued to pay astronomical tax sums, at least they had banners to hang. Like, what the Suns, what do they have to show for this? Are they going to hang a play-in banner? Like, I don't know. Shantelle, I know you also cover other sports as well, and I was curious, can you think of any team right now across the sports landscape, like forget just the NBA, across North American sports, can you think of any team right now that is as depressing, to consider their future than the Suns are in the NBA? Because I can't.
No, this is hot trash. Like, this is absolutely terrible when you think about what the Suns have done, because you mentioned it. They have a very tough schedule for the rest of the year. Will they even make the play-in tournament? Maybe they can if KD, Bradley Beal, and Devin Booker all play together and ball out, but they rarely play together. All three of those guys are rarely healthy. One of them is always sitting out. So if I think about any other teams or franchises out of any other sports that are like this, I don't think so. I think the Phoenix Suns are arguably one of the worst franchises right now when you take a look at what's going on with the salary cap and the players that they have. It's an absolute mess.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to the question of what can they do or what will they do next. So obviously we know they tried to do a lot at the deadline. They wanted Bradley Beal to waive his no-trade clause. That to me seems like a non-starter. Like, sure, it's great to hope he will, but he probably isn't going to. So they try to move KD, and then that doesn't work. Obviously, they still can do that, and I'm like, they can get some stuff for KD. He's still KD, but trading Kevin Durant at this stage of his career, they're not going to get the same haul that that Brooklyn got when Phoenix traded for him at a different stage of his career. So it kind of brings me to like the question Suns fans probably don't want to hear asked, but do they have any other choice but to explore trading Devin Booker this summer? Not because he's not a good enough player to build around or anything like that. No indictment on him, but simply because they're screwed if they keep this band together. They're not going anywhere, and they're going to, pay all these taxes and ramifications for it, roster constricting ramifications, all this. But if they trade anyone else, they're not going to get enough back to truly start a proper rebuild, or like to even have the assets to start a rebuild. Like, it seems to me moving Devin Booker might be their only option, and it's a shame that that's the case. But am I wrong?
Yeah, I think they're going to have to go down that road. And he does come with term left, so like teams that are trading for him, you're not simply getting for a rental. I think he's under contract for 3 more years about that, so it's not like you have to worry about, all right, do we have to convince him to sign a long-term extension? Like, you're trading for Devin Booker in his prime, still performing at a high level. And like you said, like Kevin Durant, he's going to be 38 by the time next season starts. Like, realistically, what are teams going to, give in order to get 38 guys who's also on an expiring deal? And again, there's, in comparison to Booker, Durant hasn't signed his extension yet. Yeah. He is eligible for one this summer, so perhaps he does get traded to a team and he decides to sign the extension that he's eligible for. But I think you got to start with Booker and see if you can at least restock those draft cupboards because they're empty right now.
Yeah. Shantelle, if you're running the Suns, are you exploring Booker trades this summer, or you think that's kind of crazy?
I'm trying to trade everybody, and I'm also trying to get Bradley Beal to remove that trade clause as well and trade him too. I would blow it up because your future looks terrible. KD is aging. He probably doesn't really want to be there, even though he said, he likes being there. He likes the locker room and all that. But this is a team that has underachieved every season. And, you make the play to go get Bradley Beal after you trade DeAndre Ayton when you probably could have got someone better. And he has barely played throughout his time there in Phoenix. He's always injured. So I would be looking to trade Devin Booker, arguably one of the best Phoenix Suns of all time, other than, Steve Nash, obviously Canadian. And then, you have Kevin Durant, who you could probably move him, not get a lot of pieces, but I think you got to look for the future, and it's just not working in Phoenix. And I think you have to blow it up at this point.
Yeah, it's like such an indictment of this team's like process over the last few years that we've gotten to a point where we're saying the only option left is probably trading Devin Booker, who is still very much in his prime, like having one of his best seasons ever. And we're saying that might be what they have to do. The fact that they've allowed it to get to that point is pretty pathetic on their part. All right, we're sticking with just absolutely depressing NBA storylines to start the show today, because from Phoenix in the West, we go to Philly in the East, where, man, just 5-alarm fire when it comes to Joel Embiid's health. That left knee that's been bothering him since last year. He tore the meniscus in it January 30th, 2024. We're now at the end of February 2025, so it's been about 13 months that this knee has been bothering him, has not been fixed despite a procedure last year. He came back admirably, tried to give it a go against the Knicks in the playoffs. Didn't go well. This year, he's only played 19 games. It's still bothering him. He's looked like a shell of himself when he has played. He has admitted he probably has to do something to fix it at some point, whether that's surgical or otherwise. The Sixers now reportedly are doing some imaging and exploring all options for him. I guess the possibility of shutting him down for the season is on the table. There's a lot we can talk about there. It's an obvious thing to just say it sucks and it's terrible and all that, but the question that I keep coming to is like, okay, so you've kind of admitted you rushed back to play in the playoffs. Admirable again, but it didn't help you. Now a year later, we see that it's still bothering you. How in God's name, or why in God's name, would Joel Embiid have played in the Olympics knowing the state of his knee, and why would the Sixers have let him? Like, I don't want to take away from a guy I get it. It's the Olympics. It's the biggest honor an athlete can have, and yet everyone wants to be there. And from the Sixers' perspective, they, at the time, were still hoping Embiid would sign an extension, so maybe they just didn't want to piss him off. But, he's a 7-foot, 280-pounder with injury problems who is on a bad knee. Why would you let him go play for Team USA? They really needed the help. Can either of you help me understand why this was allowed to happen?
Yeah, it's that's where it all started. Going to the Olympics was, the biggest mistake for himself and his team, and who knows how long they'll be paying for this now in the future. It was clear he wasn't 100%. When you knew he missed training camp, when you missed the preseason, you start to ask the questions of if he wasn't, able to participate in training camp or preseason, and now this dip in the regular season, it's how is he clear to kind of go to the Olympics? And one situation I kind of thought myself was the Clipper situation with Kawhi. Obviously he's had his injury history as well. Had the torn ACL, and there was some understandable caution and concern from the Clippers. At the time, it was called a mutual decision between the Clippers and USA Basketball.
Team USA sent him home, is what we're
after he took part in camps in Vegas. But the fact that Kawhi ended up missing pretty much half the season. He didn't come back until last month. I start to think to myself, if that guy competed in the Olympics, who knows how much time that he would have missed this season. So I go back to Embiid, it's the complete opposite situation. He instead competes in the Olympics. He doesn't play until, I think, game 9 or 10 this season. He's only made 19 appearances. And you just signed this guy to an extension, and all that money on that extension is fully guaranteed.
They still owe him $243 million over the next 4 years.
They're on the hook on that, regardless of whether he plays or not. So, going back to the whole Olympics part, it's if he had any sort of doubt, or if the team saw anything in tests, they have all the medical paperwork. It's how is he cleared at all or allowed to participate? Makes no sense at all.
Absolutely not.
It's the Olympics, so guys want to play for the Olympics, and I understand all that, but they should have did the Kawhi Leonard and just shut him down. That's what they should have done, because I hate to say it, but do the 76ers kind of look like the Phoenix Suns in a couple of years? It's like foreshadowing. We just talked about the Phoenix Suns, and it looks like Philly might look like this too. For Joel Embiid, I think it's time that, they just sit him out. He goes and gets surgery. Maybe he goes and sees the doctors Kobe saw in Germany. I don't know, but he looks terrible. And he's only going to get worse. We don't know how many more games he has left this season that he could play. They should sit him out. It's a wrap for Philly this season. And there's so many question marks for Philly other than Embiid. I think Paul George might be one of the worst signings of the offseason. It's brutal for them. It looks really bad. And I'm taking a look, and, we talked about them trading Devin Booker. Is Philly going to be in a situation where they maybe have to move a young guy like Tyrese Maxey and get something back for him? Because Embiid is 30 years old. I believe he's 30.
Yeah, he'll be 31 in a few weeks.
Yeah, and, you take a look at Embiid and you take a look at his whole career. I mean, he came into the NBA out of Kansas injured. Like, this guy has been dealing with injuries his whole entire career. To go to the Olympics was probably one of the biggest mistakes that the 76ers and Embiid could have made, and they're paying for it now. This season is a wrap, so they should just shut it all down at this point.
Yeah, I'm with you there, because the one thing that does separate Philly from Phoenix is that at least Philly does have draft picks, and like their future isn't quite as torched as the Suns are. So they could look at a season like this and just say, okay, we're clearly not going anywhere. We're not even in a play-in spot right now. Even if we get in and Embiid's banged up, we're not going to win this year. We're the 6th worst team in the league. Let's just shut him down, get him healthy, do whatever we need to do to get him healthy. Shut Paul George down if you have to create some fake injury to get him out of the lineup if you have to get him right for next season, and go into the tank. Again, if the season ended right now, they'd have the 6th best odds of getting a generational talent in Cooper Flagg, or maybe one in Dylan Harper, whatever. If they just get a top 6 pick next year, and you add that to a hopefully healthier Embiid with Maxey still there, a hopefully rejuvenated Paul George. I know it's a lot of ifs, but at least there's like some path there for hope in Philly as opposed to Phoenix. But I think I agree that it starts with them just shutting Embiid down right now and not caring about the rest of this season, which, we talked about how much of an indictment it is in Phoenix that they've gotten to a point where their only option is trading Devin Booker. Again, an indictment of just how, and an indication of how insanely bad things have gone in Philly, that in year one of the Big Three era there, in year one of Paul George's 4-year max, we're talking, just after midseason about how, well, they got to shut them down and just go into the tank. Like, it's not as concerning as Phoenix, but very concerning. Just shut them down, look to the draft, and hopefully come back better next year.
Yeah, with Philly, at least you also have Tyrese Maxey, you have Jared McCain. Obviously they come back next year as 2 young pieces that you're going to have under contract. And going into this offseason, they have a lot of money coming off the books. So obviously there's no simple, quick fix to this. If you're a superstar player like Joel Embiid, if you're a big free agent signing, Paul George isn't healthy. I mean, it doesn't matter really who you kind of add there, but you get a high pick in the draft. You never know. You add that to this core, and, maybe there's a lot of hypotheticals here, but it's at least a little bit more optimistic, I would say, than being a Suns fan.
Yeah, I think the most concerning thing for Philly, I guess, even if you're trying to, see a glass half full perspective, the problem is that, like, in the 15 games, all 3 of Embiid, George, and Maxey have been in the lineup, they still have a losing record. They're 7-8.
It's terrible.
And they've lost the minutes. All 3 of those guys are on the court at the same time. So, again, their excuse would likely be, well, it's with like Embiid at half strength. If he was at full strength, it wouldn't be like that. But right now, the only evidence of those 3 guys playing together is they're a pretty mediocre team. And that's obviously not good enough.
Yeah, even with Paul George, though, I feel like him and Maxey should be playing pretty well. They should still be winning games. They still have some depth on that team. So I feel like there's no excuse for Philly. I just feel like they've had a terrible season, and they can't just put it all on Embiid, even though he is that key piece.
Yeah, I mean, they had George and Maxey in the lineup, I think, last night or 2 nights ago, and they got their doors absolutely blown off by the Bulls of all teams. So, yeah, a lot of questions.
They're down 50.
Yeah, like, that's unbelievable. No excuse for that. All right, staying in the East, last segment, last topic, while I've got both of you here. Closer to home, the Raptors, surprisingly, were buyers at the deadline. This is the 3rd deadline in a row where you could say the Raptors were like 11th hour buyers instead of sellers while sitting outside the postseason picture. 2 years ago, they traded a first rounder for Jakob Poeltl while outside the play-in picture. Last year was a little different because they were sellers in the sense that they traded Siakam and Anunoby, but at the deadline itself, they made a trade to get a Olynyk and to take a flyer on Ochai Agbaji, which I think has worked out for them, so I'm not holding it against them. But then this year, they trade for Brandon Ingram and then extend them while 20 games under 500. So they've kind of always zigged when everyone expects them to zag. Anyway, here they sit, fifth worst team in the league. Brandon Ingram can best help them right now by not playing and preserving their lottery
Shut it down.
odds. Yeah, which is easier to convince him to do when he's already got the extension. But I'm curious for both of your thoughts on this. Do you understand and support the bet and the long-term bet on Brandon Ingram? And do you see the logic behind it no matter where the Raptors were in the standings this year? Or do you think this is kind of spinning the wheels a little bit and is putting them on the fast track to mediocrity, which is what the rebuild was supposed to avoid?
Yeah, I probably am a little bit skeptic in terms of the on-court fit. You know, you have two guys in Scotty and Ingram that are pretty heavy mid-range players. So obviously they're young, their games can change, they can evolve over the time. But at the current moment, you know, a lot of, you know, their games are very similar. So I do wonder how that is going to fit. And like you said, in terms of like, are we kind of speeding up the process to mediocrity where you want to avoid that at all costs? There's a lot of money that's now tied into, you know, RJ Barrett, Quickly, Barnes, even Jakob Poeltl. Like, there's a lot of money tied into a team that's currently not even in the play-in spot. So I think there's that kind of, if you read the writing on the wall, it kind of seems like at least one or two of these players won't be there for the long term, and they're going to have to kind of decide over the next year or so as to like who fits this long-term picture, who fits that timeline. Because that's a lot of money in terms of tying up to a lot of, like, again, we talked about the teams being limited with the aprons, all the ramifications these days. Like, it's even far more important nowadays to be able to kind of maximize and find value out of players' contracts and salaries.
Yeah.
I think for myself, I feel like obviously the Pelicans were trying to get rid of Brandon Ingram as well and dump some of that salary cap because they're doing a rebuild there. And then also for Brandon Ingram, I think the biggest question was he going to sign that extension that Toronto offered him? Because you know the past in Toronto with guys not really wanting to play in Canada. And the fact of the matter is, where else was Brandon Ingram going to get that money? If you take a look at other teams, he wasn't going to get that money anywhere else. So that's why I believe he did sign the extension. He got the bread. And I'm not trying to be negative here, but like we've seen what's happened in the past in Toronto. But here's kind of the positive fact of it is that you have an Emmanuel Quickly, you have a RJ Barrett, you have a Brandon Ingram, and you have a Scotty Barnes. And that is some very good young talent. Now, in terms of Brandon Ingram and Scotty Barnes, you know, playing a little bit similar, I still feel like Scotty Barnes is your guy. Brandon Ingram just adds a little bit more depth, and he is a solid player. If he can stay healthy and the Toronto Raptors make some more moves, they can be a team in the East that can cause you some problems. I still think they need a few more pieces, but I'm actually not mad at this fit at all.
No, I hear you. And like, you know, the positives are, okay, obviously the risks are, you know, you mentioned if he stays healthy. So like the last, I think 8 years, he's averaged only 55 games played per 82 games. That's concerning. You know, whether he meshes with Scotty Barnes or whether they need more shooting and movement around them, like that's a concern. I get all that. And the fact that, you look at this team, like if you add a top 5-ish first round pick salary next year with Ingram's, you're looking at a team that's like just about at the tax. And they'll be a lot better, but they're not going to be a contender. And like I said, like the whole point of them admitting or committing to a rebuild was because you don't want to be one of those teams that's like, a tax team just to be a first round out. It looks like they might be that as soon as next year and for the next couple of years. But the glass half full part of it is, Shantelle, to your point, like Brandon Ingram wanted to be in Toronto. Now, whether it's because they're the only team that was willing to give him the money he wanted, maybe. But at least there is something, I think, to the fact that he wanted to be here. He's embracing being here. And they are just adding more talent. I would have been a lot more negative about this deal if they had like moved one of their own first round picks, they just moved that Indiana pick that they got in the Siakam deal, or if they had moved one of their good young players, I would have kind of wondered what they're doing and what they're doing it for. But they brought in Brandon Ingram. They essentially just added a lot more talent without getting rid of any of their own picks. They still have all of their own first rounders at their disposal. And they didn't move any of those promising youngsters. Like, okay, you talk about Barnes and Dick and Barrett and Quickly, but they also didn't move any of the rookies like a Mobo or a Walter or a Shed or a Battle. So there's still a lot of young talent here. They have a lot of flexibility when it comes to trades because they have all their picks. They could still go and try to get another star if they wanted to. And I think for right now, Ingram just makes them better. They can take a step next year. He's not affecting their lottery odds in the short term because he is injured. So they could very well get a Flag or a Harper and add that to Ingram and all these pieces next year. And it can look really good. And then the last glass half full thing that I'll kind of say about this is I think people sometimes look at athletes, look at players and assume they're finished products in their mid-20s. Kind of like, development is for the youngest players, guys on their rookie scale contracts. Like Brandon Ingram might not be a complete player yet at 26, 27. He might still have development to come. And, the thing I would reference is that the guy who is going down as the greatest Raptor of all time so far, Kyle Lowry, came to Toronto less accomplished and less enthused to be a Raptor than Brandon Ingram is coming at 27 years old. Lowry was 26 at the time. But again, I'm not saying Brandon Ingram's going to be the best Raptor of all time, but my point is it's very possible he can get better even at this stage of his career in Toronto.
Yeah, and guys are still evolving. Like you said, he's 27 right now. Players are always looking for ways to kind of evolve. I mean, this might be kind of an extreme comparison, but even look at LeBron, a guy that is shooting more threes than ever at this stage of his career. Like, that was never a part of his game earlier in his career. And so, yeah, like you said, they're young. They're also going to have a full off season to kind of work out together, learn each other's tendencies, get to know each other on a personal basis. I think that is kind of a big part of getting this contract negotiations out of the way, is that's not even a distraction. It's not going to even be a plant of doubt in their head that he's not coming back. They know he's in here. He's committed for the long haul. And they're going to get a chance to kind of see how this works out. And him being in the locker room right now, being part of practice, seeing the playbook, and he can kind of envision how he kind of fits in and provides his own input. Like having that months before he even makes his on-court debut, I think that's going to definitely help for sure.
Yeah, it's a nice head start.
Yeah, and Brandon Ingram also a great three-point shooter as well. So you got someone on the wing that can be reliable in that way. And, with the young talent that they have, I like the pairing. I'm not too mad at it. And the fact that he does want to stay in Toronto because he signed that deal, I feel like that's positive.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. We finished the segment with some positive talk
vibes
after talking about the Sixers and Suns, which, you can't find any positives there. But Chicco, Shantelle, appreciate both of you. Shantelle, appreciate you making your Unfiltered show debut. I'm sure we'll have you on again at some point.
For sure. Thanks for having me on, guys. It was fun.
Thanks again to Chicco and Shantelle for their time. Next, I want to bring in Dr. John Presvelos to help us understand a little bit more about Victor Wembanyama's diagnosis. And there is Dr. John Presvelos, the head physician for the Ontario Hockey League's Oshawa Generals, and also the Sport and Exercise Medicine Program Director at Toronto Metropolitan University. Also, my high school classmate. John, what's going on? Dr. Presvelos, what's going on?
Hey, Joe. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course, man. I wanted to have you on because I'm sure you saw, kind of a scary diagnosis in the NBA last week with Victor Wembanyama, the future face of the league, diagnosed with deep vein thrombosis. And, I think for a lot of us kind of just general NBA fans or people who pay attention to sports, we see it as something that's like, oh, we read about it from time to time and it's ended some people's careers and it hasn't some others, but none of us actually know like what's going on and what it is and what the possibilities are and prognosis. So I really wanted to have you on and appreciate you joining us. So I'll get right into it. My first question, I guess, is can you explain to us what exactly deep vein thrombosis is?
So it's a term that describes basically what it is, which I like. So deep vein, so it's in the larger veins. The veins are the vessels that bring the deoxygenated blood back to the heart. And it's a thrombosis or an occlusion of that vein. So it's basically a blockage that forms inside one of those deep veins. Now, the clinical concern from the medical team is not the actual blockage itself. It's more so what could become of that blockage. So if that blockage dislodges from the deep vein where it sits and it goes to the heart and then the lungs, it becomes what's called a pulmonary embolism, and that can be life-threatening.
Wow. So yeah, if left untreated or if for some reason they hadn't caught it, it could have been something that, was that serious going forward.
Correct. And they're not an easy diagnosis to make. You usually have to have quite a high level of suspicion of what's going on, because, he's a professional basketball player with right shoulder pain. There are lots of other causes for that pain. And this is quite a rare diagnosis. So you really have to have it on your radar.
You mean rare in general? Like DVT is rare in general? Okay. So what about in terms of athletes themselves? Like, is a guy as big as Victor Wembanyama and, a professional athlete who's flying a lot with their travel schedule, are they more predisposed to getting deep vein thrombosis?
I think that's a great question. And, I think it brings up a distinction that's worth mentioning. So in some cases, long travel does increase the risk of a deep vein thrombosis. That's a lower extremity, so in the legs, in the calf muscles, that would affect a deep vein thrombosis in that area. So I believe that's what Chris Bosh had a few years ago. From my understanding, the Wembanyama one is a different entity. It's an upper extremity deep vein thrombosis. So in that case, though, that's not a risk factor. It's more an overuse type phenomenon that happens due to repetitive overhead stress.
Wow. Okay. So in that case, I guess being a basketball player might just make him a little more susceptible than the general public.
Correct. We see it in overhead athletes, so basketball players, throwing athletes like baseball players in their dominant arm, rowers, people that are doing repetitive motions over and over again with that arm.
Interesting. Okay, so you mentioned the distinction between a lower extremity DVT and an upper extremity. Is there any difference in terms of concern or seriousness or prognosis based on where it is in the body, or is it kind of all the same?
I'd say in the acute sense, it's all the same. You want to treat it to prevent it becoming a pulmonary embolism. But often with the case of an upper extremity deep vein thrombosis, you have to look at why that happened. Usually it's due to a tightening of the space in the shoulder called the thoracic outlet. And that is a space where basically you have your major nerves, arteries, and veins running through that supply that upper extremity. And if that space is too tight and an athlete is doing repetitive overhead activity, then that can be a risk factor for developing a deep vein thrombosis in that area. So then that needs to be addressed, whereas you don't have that same sort of structural component to it in the lower extremity.
Okay. And in terms of, like what the next steps are, a treatment plan, things like that, I mentioned off the top that, you are a team doctor for a major junior hockey team. Like if an athlete was presented to you with this case, how would you recommend it being treated?
So I think, I'll preface this by saying, I'm the primary care sports medicine doctor for them. This is usually a subspecialized area in terms of like, you would get them to see a vascular surgeon probably. But from the cases, that I've been involved with, it's, you have to do anticoagulation, which means the patient is put on a blood thinner medication. So that prevents future clots from forming and breaks down the clot that they have. The issue with that is that when patients are on that type of medication, they're precluded from being in contact sports during that time that they're on that medication. Because any sort of, they take bumps and bruises all the time, and that could become something serious when they're on that medication, potentially even life-threatening.
Wow.
So they're not allowed to participate in sport with that medication. And usually with the case of the upper extremity deep venous thrombosis that we discussed, usually something is done called a thoracic outlet decompression. So that thoracic outlet space that we were discussing, they either resect part of the muscle, part of the first rib, depending on the anatomical issue that's going on, to open up that space to prevent recurrence of this happening.
Okay, and is there, like we think of athletes suffering like a broken bone or a sprained wrist or whatever, and we have timelines in mind. Okay, well, it usually takes this much time. With a situation like this, is there really like a target date, would you say, where you'd say, okay, this is the average return to competition thing, or is it just too unpredictable to even be talking about timelines yet?
I think the second case. I think these are quite case-based specific, and even the specifics of a procedure, if one needs to be done, would determine the return to play after that. And I definitely don't know, but the medical team that's involved would have an idea. But this is definitely something season ending, as the Spurs have said. But I think the most recent example that we have is Brandon Ingram's example, where he came back for the next season, and thankfully hasn't been an issue since for him.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that leads me to my last question, because you mentioned Brandon Ingram, who experienced this a few years ago, and it hasn't been an issue since. Obviously, you mentioned Bosch during our talk as well. That's kind of the scary example everyone thinks of a guy who tried to, came back, it happened again, and then his career was ended. Does Wemby going through this right now make him more susceptible to it happening again? Or is like the Chris Bosh situation more the exception than the norm?
So I think without knowing too many of the details around the case, I can sort of give my sort of medical speculation here. But in the case of upper extremity DVTs, usually if there's an underlying anatomical reason it's happening, so for example, a tightening of that thoracic outlet space that I referred to earlier, if it's addressed, it shouldn't be an issue down the road. Usually you don't see too many recurrences when it's due to a mechanical issue and that mechanical issue is addressed.
All right. Well, Dr. Presvelos, we appreciate you coming on to break it all down for us. We hope that we don't have to talk to you again about this, but it's good knowing we have you in case we ever do need some sort of medical explanation.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Joe, for having me. Have a great day.
All right, back in the studio now, where we've replaced Chicco Nacion with Scott Campsall, the Score's Director of Social. What's going on, Scott?
What's up, man? I don't know how much of an upgrade or downgrade that is, but I guess we're about to find out.
Yeah, well, the reason I wanted to have you on is because I know you were at All-Star Weekend in San Francisco. I was not. I was on my honeymoon many, many miles away.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thanks. Appreciate that. But in following along on social media while I was there, not that intently in case my wife's watching, but in following along a little bit on social media while I was on my honeymoon, just to see kind of what the vibe was, I got the sense, and from watching stuff after when I got home, I got the sense that it was not well received, and I wouldn't say it went horribly wrong, but it went a little off the rails, and this plan to do the mini tournament and things like that didn't achieve the desired effect the NBA's been seeking for years now of kind of fixing the All-Star game and making players care. So again, that's my perspective from many, many miles away. You were there. I need your take on it. How was the new format received on the ground by the players, the fans in the arena, fans around the arena? Talk to me.
It's a great question. The vibes were not high, I think it's safe to say, pretty much across the board. I think that there are a variety of reasons for that. Like, I think number one, the format is odd. And I think that is kind of just like, I think, we can talk whether or not you think LeBron's injury was legitimate, but him kind of coming out and basically saying on the day of that I'm not going to play in this, I think that's a tough look for the league. But I think there were a couple of reasons. Number one, the target scores of 40 is a very low score for all-star games. So I think as soon as you were kind of finding a rhythm with the game and getting into it, the game was over. I think there were a ton of interruptions, whether it was Kevin Hart, whether it was commercials, whether it was the lengthy. During the finals, they took, I don't know how long that break was. So it was 20 plus minutes to honor the NBA and TNT guys, which respect to them, they deserve it.
And
but it's just...
to remind people, one of the reasons players said it was hard to play hard and also games was because there was like lengthy interruptions all the time that ruined their flow.
Absolutely. And that, I think that was a bummer for everybody. I think the fans, there was no energy there. You could tell the players, it was tough for them to get back into the game. I think it was 11-1 at that point too. So it was a really odd time to break. And post game, a lot of guys addressed that. Shea and Tatum addressed it, directly in their post game press conferences. Shea said he had troubles with the starts and stops. So did Jason Tatum. I think honestly the players, the vibe I got was that they weren't exactly thrilled that a Rising Stars team got to play in the All-Star game. I think nobody would come out and say it, but I think Tatum kind of addressed it generically, and I think there were a few comments here and there. There were just a lot of different things that, once you add to an All-Star game, which is kind of inherently an exhibition, makes it pretty challenging for guys to engage.
I get all that, and I think I see most of their points. The one thing I would push back on is Tatum insinuating that maybe the players were a little perturbed that a Rising Stars team made the All-Star game. Well, maybe if you guys played like you gave a shit, and we'll get into this,
Yes.
but give a shit to a certain degree.
Yes.
Again, I've said it for a long time. No one is expecting them to go all out. I'm not expecting them to dive 5 rows deep into the stands, to save a possession in an All-Star game. But the fact that the 24 best players in the world couldn't even be bothered to pretend they cared or get a hand up on defense once every 3 or 4 possessions is the reason we've gotten to this point, and is the reason they tried to come up with this format where, in the end, a Rising Stars team's in the All-Star game. Sorry, Jason Tatum.
And that's a fair point. I think honestly what adding that Rising Stars team to the All-Star game did was actually give a little bit more juice to the Rising Stars game. I don't know if it actually affected the All-Star game that well. Obviously those guys didn't want to lose to the Rising Stars team. But on Friday, it's the same format for those of you that don't necessarily watch the Rising Stars game. Same format, except there was one G League team. So it was honestly mimicked the exact same thing. And, I was sitting with friends of the show, the Hello Welcome Pod guys, and they were getting pretty hyped on the fact that the G League team could really make the All-Star game, which I think, again, juiced up the Friday night game. But then, to see the players kind of interact with the G League guys, I don't think that would have been well received either. So it's kind of interesting because on paper, it seems like that's a good solution. It's if these guys won't play hard against each other, you sure as hell they'll play hard against guys who they don't, may not think deserve to be there. Yeah. But on the other hand, then it's kind of I can see there being an issue with why the guys might not be psyched that, the Thompson twins are playing in the All-Star game or.
Yeah. And in their defense, I will say that I've been advocating for years that the league should expand All-Star rosters because it's been at 24 players, 12 when it was a 2-team deal for all those years, it was 12 players per team, 12 from the East, 12 from the West. It's still 12 from the East, 12 from the West, now just dispersed among other teams. But the point is, it has been 24 players for decades now, even though the league has expanded. There are more teams than there were before, and rosters themselves have expanded across the league. So what's in effect happened? You get all these old heads always complaining about how it's easier nowadays. Well, in fact, at least when it comes to things like All-Star, All-NBA, it is harder than ever to make those teams because a shrinking percentage of active players actually end up making the team. So I've been advocating for years they should actually expand to 30 All-Stars, have 15 on each team. And even if a couple don't get to play in the game, that's fine. They still get to say they're All-Stars. They're still an honor with that. They still get to take part in All-Star weekend. So from that perspective, I get it, where it's hey, they could make space for 6 more All-Stars instead of having potentially a G League team there or rookies and sophomores. But it still does come back that you also got to try harder.
100%. And I think that's a good point, and it's well taken, especially when you look at this year, because the guys that are not getting to make the team are a lot of guys who I think would play harder in the game. Right. And you look at this year, you had Ant and LeBron not play in the game at all without getting a roster replacement. So, I know a lot of people online were clamoring for, a guy like Norman Powell who participated in the 3-point shootout, did all his media responsibilities, was there all weekend, and then didn't get to play in the big game because other guys took up a spot, you know? And to even see him, again, Ant, LeBron don't play, Rising Stars get to play, and then Norman Powell just has to sit and watch it from the stands, and I don't think that's a particularly good look either.
No, I completely agree. It would suck if you are Norman Powell to have to watch there and sit there kind of helplessly.
Yeah.
Or for a guy at home to sit there and watch this, be really. Okay, that brings us to what's become the topic of February every year for the last few years, which is All right, so then what do they do to fix it? And they tried this, and by the sounds of it, it didn't work. By the looks of it, it didn't work. So now people are talking about, okay, well, what if they do a one-on-one tournament where the winner gets $1 million, kind of similar to what the Unrivaled League, the Women's League did, the 1v1 that I believe Collier won?
She sure did, yeah.
Okay, so that's an option. People talk about USA versus the world because of all the buzz generated by the Four Nations face-off in hockey. Do you have a potential fix? Do you care enough? Because that's another important question too. Should the league care as much about this as they seem to?
Okay, I'm going to run down your question point by point because I do have a lot of thoughts on this as someone who was there and honestly just talked about this all weekend. Number one, so I've never been at an NBA event where so many people have mentioned hockey before in my life because of obviously the synergy there with it being Four Nations, which is their like all-star replacement, and there being such buzz around it, that being kind of compared. I think a USA versus World format could work for sure, but I think comparing it to the Four Nations Cup is really... Or face-off, sorry, is really, it's not apples to apples. Yeah. You know, those guys haven't gotten to play in the Olympics recently. So, like the NHL players.
There hasn't been best on best international hockey in like 9 years or something. Yeah,
exactly. So, you know, there was also, I think Four Nations was not on anyone's radar until external political factors popped up.
So the president of the United States talked about annexing Canada.
Yeah, exactly. And that certainly juiced things up. And until puck dropped on that first USA-Canada game where they just started punching each other in the face, there was not the same sort of vibe around it. So I would put that in a category of its own. Like, that's a very specific thing. I think USA versus World, like, is it worth a shot? Sure. Like, do you have some inherent pride there? Sure. But I also think in terms of that comparison, what made, you know, they just had the Olympics. That Netflix doc just came out. We just saw how special that was. I don't think there is a recreating that in the All-Star game. You know, 1v1, I think, is a good idea on paper. There were a couple of journalists, I think Rachel Nichols was one of them, asking the guys what they thought. A lot of guys seem to be into it. But I just have a hard time seeing guys willing to sort of forego a vacation in the middle of the season to come and get potentially embarrassed on national TV.
That's it.
And, like, I just don't see guys signing, like, $1 million or not, I don't see a guy signing up for that.
That's a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up because one of the things I've talked about in the last few years, too, as I've talked about the kind of, like, slow deterioration of all-star pride and, like, competitiveness in All-Star Weekend, you know, we talk about it with the game now, but before the game, it was the dunk contest.
Yes.
Where there used to be a time, first long before we were around, and then also during our childhoods, when the best young stars would participate in the dunk contest. And only one won, and the rest lost, but it like wasn't, you take part and you compete, and maybe you lose. That's part of being a professional athlete, even in an all-star format, or in a skills competition format. At some point, and I know a lot of people will point to LeBron because he was kind of, I think, the first of that stature of star to not do it in his younger years. Mm-hmm. Whether it was the LeBron factor, whether it's the fact that players just make astronomical amounts of money now compared to their previous peers, whatever the case may be, at some point, players got to a point where it was almost like either not worth their time to do this, or maybe it's the social media era, the era of trolling. I've said it before, but it seems to me that players have gotten to a point where they seem to think there's more to lose by, maybe in terms of like a social currency, whatever, there's more to lose by showing up, trying, and losing than there is by just showing us they don't care.
Absolutely.
And I think the dunk contest that's what happened at the dunk contest. And to your point, I think that's why even in a one-on-one tournament where it's like, it sounds great, and an extra $1 million, players, even a rich player still wants more money. That's all true, but they'll find a way to not participate because no one wants to be the guy losing in the one-on-one. And that's where competitive pride comes in. It's like, you don't want to lose, but you got to try. If you don't put yourself in a position to maybe lose, you also can't win.
Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail right on the head there. Like, my thought has long been, it's been sort of the internet. Maybe LeBron's early career probably doesn't tie directly into like the social media age or the instant feedback age. But I think the further we get into that, and you see how crazy people are on the internet and how much they're tagging athletes and all kinds of crazy stuff. Like, I do think that has to play a part, even just as like a human being, that's got to play a part in sort of your decision making, especially for the higher profile guys who are kind of, they have a brand to maintain. They have, it's not worth it to them, right? Like, truly, it's not worth it to them. But my big hot take on the All-Star game is that they should have just never admitted there was a problem. Like, if I was Adam Silver, I would have just said, guess what? It's East versus West. We play it every year. 1 out of every 5 years you get a good competitive game, and that's that. It's an exhibition.
Yeah.
We as a league are obviously just trying to sell stuff. Like you go to the All-Star game, there's a reason there's so many commercial breaks. There's a reason everything is sponsored. It's like, in my opinion, if you want the game to be more competitive and more cohesive, like you need to cut down on that. You need to get back down to bare bones. Just have a basketball game. Let these guys wear their jerseys again and have them actually see, like I think, people of our generation are nostalgia for the era of, the last All-Star game in Oakland where the guys wear their own jerseys and, you had Vince Carter and, those guys kind of going off. I think, go back to that, strip it down. To me, less is more.
Yeah.
It's just like, let's do it. This is the All-Star game. The All-Star game is East versus West. It's the best 24 guys or 28 guys if we want to expand it. Let's just have a game. It's an exhibition. It doesn't need to be galaxy brained. Like, I think once you started going down the path of let's change it to this, we're going to have Elam ending, target scores. We're going to do, drafting the players and shuffling them around. It's, it starts to get to be a bit much. Because if you're the league and you're saying, let's do this new format, let's do the tournament. Year one, you have the tournament. Everybody shits on it. Yeah. Where do you go from here? Do you double down and try to fix this? In my opinion, it's just, let's just go back to East-West. Let's build on the actual rivalries and let's depend on the players that, are your leaders, as the years come, Shea's a competitive guy. Yeah. Let him step up and be the guy that says, listen, guys, this is the year we're going to do it.
Wemby is a super good. Wemby gets pissed when other All-Stars don't try.
That is the example. That Wemby is the guy. You looked at him, you saw, everybody I think saw the clip of him acting in frustration when the game-winning play got given up. It's like, let these guys kind of step into leadership roles as we sort of hit this transition with guys like LeBron and Steph, Harden. Like, those guys are kind of, getting to be in their last legs. Yeah. We've got a new generation of guys coming in. Let these guys be the ones to come in and set the tone. Yeah. Build it from that way up. And then, I think we're in a good position where that's a possibility because those guys are kind of taking over. Yeah. And I would just love to see that. Like, make it basic. We're overthinking it.
I completely agree. Wemby, Shea, Ant, I think when Amen Thompson gets to an All-Star game, like, that there's a generation of guys coming up that I think have that competitive fire again when even with things like All-Star games, and that's what you need. Forget this generation of like the Paul Georges who was like openly said, like no one wanted to be the one guy. I didn't want to be the one guy trying. Tyrese Halliburton has talked about that too. Like, nah, I'm done with that. Yeah, someone needs to be the one. Who cares what the rest of the All-Stars think? Again, you don't have to dive 5 rows deep. Just one out of every 3 possessions, show us like you kind of half care. I think there's a generation of guys coming. Just do East versus West. Make 30 All-Stars. Give them 30 All-Stars, like I've said. And I think that's the closest you've coming to fixing something that might not necessarily need to be fixed. Last note, the USA versus the world thing. You're going to run into the same issues you had with players complaining in this current format with guys that maybe don't deserve to be there because as much as we all talk, and rightfully so, about how the world is caught up at the top, there hasn't been an American MVP since 2018. There's not going to be one this year. Like, at the top, the world's caught up. Joker, SGA, Giannis, Embiid, like all these guys. But in terms of depth, the Americans still dominate. And so even if you're just taking 24 guys, if you're saying you're going to take 12 non-Americans, there's going to be a lot of deserving All-Stars left home. And so that format doesn't work for me. Keep it simple, stupid. I love what you said. East versus West, expand them, and just count on the guys at some point. One out of every few years, you'll get a competitive game, and that's fine.
Yeah, it's like the dunk contest. It's like, I know we've gotten Mac the last couple of years, which you can debate the merits of that. But it's like, guess what? Every 5 years, someone goes, whoa, the dunk contest is back. And then guess what? The one right after that, absolute terrible, and all everyone does is shit on it. Yeah.
All right, well, appreciate you coming in, Campsall. Hopefully a year from now, when we do this again, we will have a better product to talk about. But if we don't, I guess that's all right, too. The league will be fine, even if if their mid-February event isn't all that jazzed.
Yeah, we'll be all right. We'll survive. We've seen some terrible All-Star games in our time. We'll be all right.
And we will continue to do so. All right, for Scott Campsall, for Dr. John Presvelos, for Shantelle Chand, for Chicco Nacion, my name is Joseph Casciaro. This has been The Unfiltered Show. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll catch you next week.